skin, and last time we were here, we were talking about the functions of skin: protection from radiation, protection from chemical and mechanical damage, protection from dehydration. It acts as a physical barrier to invasive microorganisms. It contains sensory receptors for light, touch, deep pressure, pain, heat, and cold. It helps to regulate body temperature, both too hot and too cold. And it also can manufacture vitamin D when it is exposed to ultraviolet light. I think that's about where we left off, all right? So a few more little fun facts, some party facts about skin. Skin has varying thicknesses. It's not the same thickness all over our body. It is at the thickest on the soles of our feet and the palms of our hands. It is the thinnest on our eyelids and on the scalp. Now, the skin is an organ. It is composed of many different tissues. It is thought to be the largest organ of the human body. If you take the average sized adult, they will have somewhere between 16 to 20 square feet of skin. So if you were to take it all off and lay it out flat, it would make a very nice sized room rug, nice area rug. 16 to 20 square feet of skin. There are,
I was just saying,
that's a lot of skin. Right? There are two main layers to our skin. This is the illustration from the Saladin textbook, the one that I recommended people buy, but not everybody did. It's a nice enough picture, it's just that this one's a little sharper and a little darker, so I'm going to go ahead and use this one, but they have the same information on them. What we're seeing here are the, you look baffled.
What?
You look confused.
I'm not.
Okay. So what we're looking at here are the two main layers to skin. You just kind of froze like that. You're like, did I lose her? Two layers to skin, right? The outermost or surface layer is called the epidermis, what we might think of as the top layer or the upper layer of the skin. And then below that we have the lower layer, the deeper layer. This is called the dermis. Now, in most of these illustrations, wow. Okie dokie. In most of these kinds of illustrations, they will also show you a layer of tissue underneath the dermis. This is in some books called the subcutaneous layer, and in other books it's called the hypodermis. Now, the hypodermis is not technically considered to be skin. What it is well, it's yellow, so that gives you a hint. What do you think it is?
Fatty tissue.
Fat, yeah. This is the subcutaneous fat. And so it's not technically considered to be part of the skin, but it almost always shows up in the pictures, and it is, in fact, a nice layer of adipose tissue. So here's the other picture, and sure enough, it's got that yellow fat in it. All right, so let's start with the epidermis. The epidermis is a stratified squamous epithelium. which tells us right away that, first of all, epidermis does not have any blood supply of its own. There's no blood vessels running through the epidermis. It is completely reliant on the lower dermis for oxygen, nutrients, and waste removal. Now, this is the illustration from your textbook of the epidermis. What we see in this picture is that it has layers of cells that look different, stain differently, have different shapes, and so on. And so what we're going to do is we're going to kind of go through this and look at these different layers, where they come from and how they are made. But this picture is not a particular favorite of mine. Let me show you some more pictures of epidermis, right? So this is from a different textbook. This is actually from the soles of the foot. This is some of the thickest skin in the body. And all of this is epidermis. Here's another fairly nice picture. Okay. Well, an epidermis is anchored onto a basement membrane. And what we see here is the basement membrane is right about here, right? And it's not a flat or planar or linear kind of arrangement. It's got all these little hills and valleys and folds where it connects to the connective tissue of the dermis. So the basement membrane's right about here. Now the cells in the basement membrane or the cells that are attached to the basement membrane are very close to the blood vessels in the dermis. They're getting lots of oxygen, they're getting lots of nutrients. These guys are going to be about as healthy as you can get. So they're healthy, they're well fed, they're well nourished, they're well oxygenated, they're metabolically active, they're doing cellular things fairly rapidly. This layer of cells that's close to the basement membrane is called the stratum basale. They're at the base, they're near the basement membrane. They're not yet squamous in shape. These guys are almost cuboidal. They're very plump, they're very round, they have lots of organelles, they're doing lots of exciting things, and they also are going to reproduce fairly often. These cells are so well nourished and so well oxygenated that they are going to divide and produce new cells at a fairly rapid pace. Well, as new cells are being made down here in the stratum basale, that's going to squeeze the older cells, the existing cells, up away from the basement membrane. So the older cells are getting pushed from below up away from the basement membrane, which means they're also getting pushed away from the blood vessels. They're getting pushed away from the supply of oxygen and nutrients. Now there are several cell types in the epidermis. The most common type of cell, the bulk of the epidermis, are cells called keratinocytes. And they get this name because they manufacture or synthesize a protein called keratin. Now, the protein keratin is kind of a weird item. First of all, it's insoluble. It won't dissolve in water. And cytoplasm is mostly water. So as soon as this protein is made, it falls out of solution and becomes a solid lump inside the cell cytoplasm. So these cells are called keratinocytes because they're making keratin. The stratum basale cells haven't made very much yet, so they're in pretty good shape. But the cells that, as they're making new cells and the older cells get pushed up and away from the oxygen, they're still making this protein keratin, but they're losing their supply of oxygen and nutrients. And so these cells are going to start to shrink down just a little bit. The more keratin they're making, the less room there is inside the cell for water. And so they're losing water, they're becoming dehydrated, and that causes the cells to shrink a little bit. So they kind of shrink down and crinkle up. And the cells develop these kind of little spiky extensions as they shrink down. And that forms the next layer, the Stratum Spinosum.
So is it like that they're dying slowly?
Yeah, that's where we're going with this. Yep. The cells are slightly shrunken. And they have a kind of a spiky or spiny appearance. But they're still making this protein keratin, and their keratin is accumulating inside the cells. Accumulate, there we go. So the cells are beginning to dehydrate. And time marches on, and new cells are being made at the stratum basale. And they're pushing these cells further and further away from the basement membrane. So the stratum spinosum cells are going to get pushed even further up. And they're continuing to make keratin, and the keratin is continuing to kind of push the water out. And so as these cells become drier, they're also starting to flatten out. They're starting to look like squamous cells. And so the next layer is called the Stratum Granulosum. The cells have now lost so much water that they've actually started to flatten out from the pressure. And as they're losing water, the internal components of the cells, the organelles, the cytoskeleton, the Golgi body, the mitochondria, and everything is becoming more condensed. These cells are becoming more compact, and everything's becoming more concentrated inside. And so typically what we see with the stratum granulosum is the cells look grainy or gritty, and they're flat, and they stain very darkly. So we get this layer of kind of dark, dense looking cells, the stratum granulosum. Yes, sir.
Where do the lost liquids go?
They're eventually going to percolate their way back into the blood.
Okay.
Yeah. So here's the stratum basale, here's the stratum spinosum, here's the stratum granulosum. So these cells are becoming flat. They're becoming very condensed. They're becoming very dry as they accumulate even more keratin. They have a gritty, a granular appearance.
Bless you.
Wow. Sneezy city here tonight. Now, these guys have lost so much water that they are really now having real trouble maintaining their own lives. And in the stratum granulosum, the cells are going to begin to die. They're too far away from the blood vessels to get any more water, and they're losing oxygen, and the keratin is pushing out the water they started with, and they're getting all squashed down and flattened, and they just give up and they go ahead and die. Well, when they die, the internal components of the cell, the Golgi and the mitochondria and the endoplasmic reticulum and the nucleus, begin to break down. And they're still getting pushed up from below. And so this is going to form the next layer, the Stratum Lucidum. Lucid means clear. If you work with memory care patients or people who have dementia and they're having a lucid moment, it means for that right now they're thinking clearly. So lucid means clear. And what happens is that the cells that have been pushed into or formed the stratum lucidum have simply broken down all their organelles. It's all degraded. It's all kind of just dissolved. And so these cells are now nothing more than membrane and packets of keratin. And the light goes right through them. In this illustration, for some reason, they showed the stratum lucidum as this red band here. But in a real illustration, it's going to be clear. So we get this very thin, clear line. These cells are now dead. They're dead. They're flat. They're really not much more than packets of keratin. And still they're being pressed from below. Still new cells are pushing these guys up and away, and they become even flatter. They flatten out even more. And that's going to form what's called the Stratum Corneum. This is the outermost layer of the tissue. This is the outermost layer of the epidermis. So these cells become even more compressed. They're very dry. They form these kind of flakes or scales. In this picture, that's all this. Layer after layer after layer of dead, flat scales of dead skin cells. I know. So these guys are very flat, very dry, and very dead. Now, because they are dead, and because they're dry, they have a tendency to kind of come off. People shed their skin, not the way snakes do all in one big long sheet, but every time you rub your skin, any kind of friction that's applied to the skin, some of these flakes will come off. So as you are using your body, as you are moving your body, moving your skin, putting on clothes, taking off clothes, getting out of the shower, toweling off, rolling over in bed, standing up, sitting down, walking around the room, all of that movement of the skin is causing these upper layers of stratum corneum, these dead keratinocytes, to flake off. They're microscopic, so you don't really see them go, but you're constantly shedding these stratum corneum cells. It's estimated that humans lose about 1/5 of an ounce of skin of Stratum Corneum each week. And this material is what is called Dander. This stuff just kind of comes off, floats through the air, settles down on various surfaces in your home. Dander is the Stratum Corneum cells that fall off, right? Yeah. It is a major component of house dust. When you're going around your house and you're seeing the dust on the TV screen, on your computer, on your knickknacks, on your books, in the corners, hanging off the cobwebs, that dust is mostly you. That dust is your shed skin. And so that gives you some idea of what kind of color we're talking about. It's pretty much colorless at that point. It tends to accumulate in mattresses, bed pillows, your carpets, your drapes, upholstered furniture. Everywhere where you are and your skin is coming off in little bitty flakes, this house dust, this dander will accumulate. Now, keratin is a protein, and other organisms can find this a consumable. It can be food for other creatures. House dust, for example, is the home of something called dust mites. Now, these guys are also microscopic. You cannot see them with your naked eye. But they live by feeding on these keratinized stratum corneum cells everywhere that you have shed them. So they're in your carpets, they're in your drapes, they're in your upholstered furniture, they're in your pillows, they're in your mattresses, feeding off of all of this skin that you have let go of. And they estimate, for example, I like fun facts, I don't know about you guys, but they estimate after 2 years of normal use, about 10% of a person's bed pillows, about 10% of the weight of your bed pillows are actually the dander that you've shed, living and dead dust mites, and dust mite waste, because they do poop. All things poop, right? Isn't there a book about that? Everybody poops. Yeah. All right. So the dust mites live in there. They reproduce in there. They make more dust mites. They poop. They die. After 2 years, 10% of your bed pillows is not pillow. It's, and I got to tell you, when I read that, I went out and bought new bed pillows. Just threw my old ones away. But it gets even worse. The typical mattress has between 100,000 to 10 million dust mites. Depending on how much age you have on your mattress and how many people have been sleeping in your bed. They estimate that in your carpet, you have about 100,000 dust mites per square yard. So, you can vacuum, you can dust, get that Swiffer out. You can launder, but you're never really going to get rid of them. There's always going to be a few to reestablish the population. And this can be a problem because there are people who develop allergies against dust. I'm sure you've met people or know people who have an allergy against house dust. It's not really the dust, it's the mites that are living on those skin cells. Because skin is probably not going to be real hyperallergenic. But they can develop problems with the dust mites. And that means that they've got to do some pretty extreme things to keep from coming in contact with these mites. So everything's wrapped in plastic. You have blinds instead of drapes or curtains. You have plastic barriers on your mattresses, wooden furniture instead of upholstered furniture, tile floors instead of carpet. And they clean and clean and clean and clean and clean just to try to keep the amount of dust mites down to a tolerable level. And they're also sneezing, coughing, hacking, taking antihistamines, Benadryl all the time. But when people say they have a dust allergy, that's probably the mites that they're actually developing an allergy to. Well, since you're constantly shedding skin, epidermis, and you're constantly making new epidermis, depending again on a person's level of activity, the entire epidermis is going to be replaced somewhere between every 14 to 50 days. Every couple of weeks, your entire epidermis has changed over from bottom to top. Now, while the keratinocytes are the most common type of cell in the epidermis, they're not the only type of cell in the epidermis. And this is one thing that this picture kind of bothers me, because almost all of these guys that are shown here in pink and purple are keratinocytes. Another type of cell I wanted to talk to you about is shown very poorly in this picture. It's this guy here. This is something called a melanocyte. And luckily for you guys, I have a better picture. Now, the melanocytes are much less common than what we see in the keratinocytes. And they're going to live their whole life down here by the basement membrane. They're not going to be migrating through the epidermis like the keratinocytes do. So this guy here is a picture of a melanocyte. They're anchored down here at the basement membrane, but they grow these extensions of their cytoplasm that kind of work their way like tentacles up and around and between the keratinocytes in the stratum basale and the stratum spinosum. They get their name because they make the pigment melanin. Which is normally colored brown. So these cells and their little tentacular extensions are going to be brown in color because they are making and storing this material called melanin. Now, melanin's kind of weird stuff. Melanin has the ability to absorb ultraviolet light. Ultraviolet light is kind of dangerous to living things. When ultraviolet light passes through a cell, it can pass through the nucleus and cause damage to the chromosomes. It will break up the genetic information of the cell. Cells are particularly vulnerable to UV damage when they're in the act of dividing, when they're going through their reproductive cycle of copying their chromosomes and then sorting them out through mitosis, they're particularly vulnerable to UV chromosomal damage. And this can cause genetic mutations, which in turn can lead to the development of skin cancer, all right? So these melanocytes, they're making this substance melanin, which will absorb ultraviolet light. So ultraviolet light is coming down through the top layers, which are pretty clear, and then it hits these extensions of the melanocytes and absorbs the UV light, which means that the UV does not get down to the stratum basale. Those cells are protected by these kind of umbrellas that have been formed by the melanocytes. So the primary role of the melanocytes is, in fact, to provide protection from ultraviolet light. By the way, room light, artificial light, doesn't really have much in the way of UV. We're talking about sunlight here when we're talking about ultraviolet light. Now, interestingly enough, people with different skin colors have about the same number of melanocytes. The typical or average human being has around 935 melanocytes per square millimeter of skin. And that's true whether you're Caucasian, African, Asian, Native American. What do they call it? Above the Arctic Circle, there's a
Inuits? Inuits?
Well, there's different groups of people depending on where on the circle you go around. So you've got like the Inuits and the Laplanders, and yeah, there's like different clan names, but there's like a generic name for the people who live above the Arctic Circle. No, it's like something Arctic, like Trans-Arctic or Super Arctic or Epi-Arctic or something like that.
Oops.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. I watch a lot of PBS. Right. Was that question or just stretch? Okay. So really, it isn't about how many melanocytes a person has that's going to determine their skin color. What determines the different colors of skin is the amount of melanin each one is making. And there are two things that control how much melanin a melanocyte will make. One of these controls for how much melanin is being made is simply genetic. A person's family, ethnic, or racial background. People with dark skin have more melanin being made per melanocyte than people with lighter colored skin. Now, typically what we find is that people whose background is from tropical regions, where the sunlight is very intense, and the exposure to ultraviolet light is almost continuous, those ethnic groups tend to have darker skin. People whose background is ethnically from more northern climates, where the sunlight is not as intense and you have shorter days and it gets cold and horrible outside, so everyone's living in a cave because they don't want to go out, those people tend to have less melanin in their melanocytes. They have lighter skin. The other thing that influences the amount of melanin that is made is environmental. In particular, exposure to ultraviolet light. The more the melanocytes are exposed to ultraviolet light, the more melanin they're going to make. So you go to the beach, you spend the day out in the sun, your melanocytes are stimulated to make more melanin, at least in those areas of your skin that were exposed to the sunlight, which is where you get tan lines and that sort of thing. Driver's arm. because that's the one that sticks out the window. Farmer tan, all that kind of stuff. This is where people get suntans and differences in their skin tone from one part of their body to another. This, of course, is going to be more temporary. So if you stay out of the suntan will fade because the melanocytes are not as stimulated. So if you stay indoors, like true Floridians do, you always know the tourists, don't you? They're the ones who look like they just got boiled. You know, real Floridians never go out in the sun. You know, the tan will fade, the color will lighten up if you don't go out in the sun. Yes, sir.
So does it become darker as a defense mechanism or just as a reactive byproduct to the UV light?
I'm going to say defense mechanism. The function of this is to protect your lower level tissues from ultraviolet light damage, to prevent genetic damage. And so when you are being exposed to more ultraviolet light, you're going to need more melanin to protect you from the increased exposure. So I'm going to say it's a defense mechanism.
So you say genetic damage, that would be like, you said cancer, is it like wrinkles and sunspots and stuff like that as well? Or is that
Sunspots, yes. Wrinkles, not so much. That's a different problem. Freckling will be caused by exposure to ultraviolet light, but I was thinking more like basal cell carcinoma, stratum basale, yeah. Yes, ma'am. Tell me when. Yes, ma'am. Layers of the epidermis, yes.
And the keratinocytes are like that.
Most of the cells in the epidermis are these keratinocytes,
And those are like the ones
making the layers.
what's down.
Yes, they're the ones who are dying. The melanocytes are pretty much going to be stuck down at the bottom. They're not going to move. So they're not only are they not going to be dying, but they're protecting everybody else from dying.
So like they're like
They're at the bottom, right? Got it? Okie doke. All right, now the melanocytes also do a couple of other interesting things. They also perform some metabolic functions. They can convert cholesterol in your skin or in the hypodermis to vitamin D. Although again, this is going to occur only when exposed to ultraviolet light. So while you're romping around on the beach in your swimsuit, exposing your skin to the sun, your skin is very busily converting cholesterol into vitamin D for you. We're going to talk about vitamin D and its role in physiology when we do the skeletal system. So we're going to revisit this in a little bit more detail down the road. But vitamin D is really the only vitamin that humans can make. Typically, we define a vitamin as something you have to get through your diet. Vitamin D is the exception to that. We can make it for ourselves, but we have to go out in the sun to do it, like a plant. Another thing these melanocytes, I can't write, talk, and think all at the same time. Another thing these melanocytes can do is, again, when exposed to ultraviolet light, they can metabolize and detoxify the substance bilirubin. Now, bilirubin is a waste product from the breakdown of red blood cells. Mention the fact that red blood cells don't live forever. Your bone marrow makes them, they go around for a few weeks, they become fragile, they don't have a nucleus, they can't repair themselves, they start to get kind of feeble and fragile, the spleen sucks them up, and gets them out of the circulation, the bone marrow will make more. You're fine. But as those red blood cells are being broken down by the spleen, this waste product called bilirubin is made. And bilirubin is yellow in color. Now this yellow bilirubin gets sent to the liver grabs it, puts it into the bile puts it into your intestines, so eventually you'll poop it out. And while it's on its way, some of it will go through the kidneys, and the kidneys will pull it out and put it into the urine to get it out of your body, and that's why your urine is yellow. It's bilirubin. Well, as the blood is passing through your skin, if the skin is being exposed to ultraviolet light, these melanocytes can also break down and detoxify and metabolize this bilirubin and get it out of the blood. This becomes kind of a thing with newborn babies. I don't know if you've ever seen this done. It's kind of a hoot. When a fetus is inside the uterus, it's making a different kind of hemoglobin for its red blood cells. It's called fetal hemoglobin, which is very good at sucking oxygen out of the placenta, all right? But when the baby's born and it comes out into the air and it takes that first deep breath, and now its blood is being oxygenated at the lungs, the bone marrow switches over to making grown-up hemoglobin, adult hemoglobin, because now the kid's breathing air. So the spleen and the liver are going to get a little overexcited about breaking down the fetal red blood cells. And as a result, many times with newborn babies, after an hour or two out in the air, they start to turn kind of yellow. And of course, their poor mom is freaking out because she thinks the kid's got hepatitis or liver disease, and you know, the kid's going to die. And, oh, my baby's got jaundice. And you know, the nurse or whoever's taking care, probably a nurse because doctors don't do anything. All right, so the nurse will come in and they'll say, no, we can deal with that. The baby will be fine. There's no liver problem. And what they do is they take them back down to the nursery and they put little baby sunglasses on them and a little baby hat that cover their head because that's kind of soft and squishy. And they stick them under the sun lamp and give them a shot of UV light. And their melanocytes in their skin will break down the bilirubin and they turn back to their normal color. They're not yellow anymore. It's kind of cool. Oh, you saved my baby. Thank you, thank you. And they get to take the sunglasses home with them because what are you going to do, right? So they get little baby sunglasses. I think it's just cute. Now, on the subject of skin color, obviously the brown color is coming from melanin. And various shades of brown come from various amounts of melanin. But human skin often has kind of a red or pink tone to it. Interestingly enough, that's actually coming from the blood. The epidermis is essentially colorless. All those keratinized dead cells, they really don't have any much in the way of natural color to them. But the dermis just underneath the epidermis does have blood vessels. And so as the blood is passing through these blood vessels, some of that red color may show through the epidermis. And of course, the more blood you have flowing through here, the pinker or redder your skin will be. So when you're embarrassed and your blood vessels get all widened out, you blush. When you get really angry and the blood is pounding through your skin, you're like turning red in the face. Yeah.
Is that why more Caucasian people turn red when they burn in the sun? Is that just a reaction?
It may be that the burn is more obvious. Yeah, the redness is more obvious against the lighter colored skin. But people with darker skin will burn too. It just may not look as lobsterish.
Okay.
And then we have the yellow color. Many people's skin has a faint yellow tint to it. that yellow color is coming from our old friend, the subcutaneous adipose tissue. Adipose tissue stores keratin. Talked about that before. So, sweet potatoes and pumpkins and squash and carrots and tomatoes, and I think oranges, I think the yellow and orange fruits are also in this category. They have lots and lots of keratin, and if you have a diet that is has these fruits and vegetables in it, you may have more keratin than you need it right that minute, and it's going to get stored in your subcutaneous fat. And like the chickens, it's going to turn your subcutaneous fat slightly yellow, which may show through the epidermis and the dermis, giving the skin a yellowish tint, right? And of course, the more of these fruits and vegetables you consume, the more yellow your adipose tissue can become, and the yellower tinge your skin is going to take on. So if you're eating nothing but pumpkin pie, pumpkin pie, that would be good right now, or carrots. Everyone's trying to lose weight this time of the year. No one's eating pumpkin pie. So if you're living on carrots and tomatoes, your skin can turn kind of an odd shade of yellow because of this keratin accumulation. Some of this may also come from certain kinds of drugs and medications. I like to tell this story because I know if she ever found out I was telling you this story, she'd kill me. But I had a roommate in college who, now you guys got to understand, this is a different generation, okay? This is before the hole in the ozone and skin cancer and never ever go out in the sun. Back when I was your age, everybody, all white people anyway, wanted a suntan. And we would spend hours lying out in the sun trying to get that perfect, healthy, bronze, athletic tan, right? And my roommate had a very active social life, so to speak. And I don't know what it was, but she came down with something, and the doctor at the health clinic gave her some antibiotics. Could have been. And he told her, he says, now, don't go out in the sun while you're taking this. You know, just stay indoors until you've gotten through the whole course, which is like 10 days usually for antibiotics. And she was like, what does he know? So, you know, she wasn't going to give up the idea of getting a suntan, so she took the drugs and then went laid out in the sun. And a day or two later, she was about as orange as an Oompa Loompa.
Wow.
I mean, she was just orange. And she was like, well, he told me. So after that, she stayed indoors, and it kind of faded away over the next few days. But the drug that she was taking interacted with the sunlight, the UV light, and developed this very distinctive orange color to it. She looked so weird. She looked so weird. Right. So yeah, certain kinds of drugs and medications can also react with sunlight and cause changes to the color of the skin. You guys know the Oompa Loompas. I mean, not the new ones, the old ones with the Gene Wilder movie. Yeah, those are the better ones. Yeah, everybody likes those better. Okay, so now we want to talk about the next layer down, which is the dermis. Dermis. Yeah, that's still not the best picture. I still don't like that. Let's go back to this one. The border between the epidermis and the dermis, as I pointed out a little bit earlier, is not a flat plane. The junction between the epidermis and the dermis is thrown into these folds and ridges, hills and valleys. It's a very uneven sort of connection. These little bumps of tissue in Latin are called papilla. So a bump of tissue is called a papilla. So with the dermis, these bumps and ridges, these hills and valleys are forming an area called the stratum papillarosum. The stratum papillarosum is the first part of the dermis right under the epidermis. Now, it's mostly areolar connective tissue. That light, open, disorganized tissue, lots of collagen fibers, but also lots of elastic fibers. It's bendy, it's stretchy, it's flexible, it can move in any direction. Very open, woven kind of appearance. Areolar, open, looser type of tissue. As we move away from the epidermis, as we're going deeper into the dermis, more and more collagen fibers are added by the cells in that area. And so there's a gradual transition from the areolar connective tissue to a dense, irregular connective tissue. And so the stratum papillarosum is gradually going to merge into a denser, less flexible area that is called the stratum reticularosum. Which is a dense, irregular proper connective tissue. As I mentioned before, the dermis does have the blood vessels. And in most parts of the body, it's pretty well vascularized. We also find a variety of sensory receptors, mostly in the dermis. We have different receptors for light touch and for deep pressure. So you can discriminate between being lightly interacted on your skin, like when a mosquito walks across you, and you can tell that from a stronger connection, like when somebody grabs you by the arm or shakes you by the hand. So we have different receptors, mostly in the dermis, for light touch and deep pressure. We also have sensory receptors for heat and for cold. And again, these are separate receptors. A lot of what we experience as heat and cold in our environment is coming to us through our skin. So people walk into this room and they're saying, oh, it's cold in here. Well, how do you know? Your skin is telling you, those receptors in your skin are telling you that it's a little on the cool side. You'd be happier wearing a jacket. Or you go outside on a nice, hot, sunny day, and you walk outside and you're like, whoa, is it hot out here? That, again, is the heat receptors in your skin that are giving you that information. And we also have receptors for pain in our skin. You know the difference between being stroked and being pinched. All right, so how are we doing so far? You guys good with skin? All right, so we're going to move on and talk about hair. And I'm probably the only person in the room with that song running through their head right now. What song? I know, nobody knows that song. The one from the musical.
Hairspray.
No, Hair.
So we.
The one about the Vietnam War.
Okay.
Yeah. You wouldn't have thought that they would make a musical about the Vietnam War, but they did. It was called Hair.
So we're not going over the subcutaneous layer?
No, it's
No.
the
Okay.
subcutaneous layer is not technically skin. So having mentioned the fact that we have fat under there, that's about all we want to talk about. All right. Pardon me? I was going to go about another 15 minutes, but everybody ready for a break? Is your head starting to feel kind of full? They don't care. I'm getting no response whatsoever.
We can take a break.
All right, I got 2 people who say they want to take a break. What do the Williams sisters say? All right? All right? 15 minutes? We'll meet back here at